Earlier, I spoke with Frank Samolis about his assessment of the talks. He's the co-chair of international trade practice at Squire Patton Boggs, and he handles matters that go before the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. My colleague, Calleb, joined the conversation as well.
It was only about 3 weeks ago when everybody was worried about an imminent trade war, and we heard about retaliation and $100 billion. That's all sort of gone to the background, and I think that is to be expected. The investigation that President Trump utilized, remember, this was initiated a year ago, and it was just, the results came out just a month or so ago. The U.S. China will hold their public hearings in a couple of weeks, but I think the temperature has cooled down very much, and we're now going to be in for a long, hard slog on some very technical trade discussions.
Sean.
Well, Frank, if you look at it in this age of globalization, if you take aim at one nation, there is collateral damage.
Right.
And we saw that, I think, already among Trump's loyal base here in the United States. Word coming yesterday that China is already buying its soybeans from Brazil and other nations. I was in Iowa not too long ago, and they told me 1 out of every 3 rows of soybeans is sold to China. So do you think Trump is going to have to step back a bit and pare back his wish list, knowing he has a chance of hurting his base?
I believe so. I think one of the mistakes that Mr. Trump has made is that he's focused almost exclusively on manufactured goods. That's why we have these tariffs on steel and aluminum. But as he found out very quickly, agricultural trade is a huge part of our trade and a huge part of our trade surplus in many instances, not to mention services. So when you look at the overall makeup of U.S. trade, it's as much agricultural and services, financial services, IT, as it is manufactured items like steel and aluminum. So you're right. And he's beginning to realize that when he imposes tariffs on steel and aluminum, as he has done, and exempts certain countries but not others, and goes after China on a 301 case, there are repercussions.
Let me continue with another demand by U.S. One of their main demands for China to cut their trade deficit by at least $200, not $100 billion by 2020. One expert called it extreme starting position here. How unrealistic is that? And is it part of the U.S. strategy to just come up with some crazy high number and meet the Chinese somewhere in the middle?
Well, I think that reflects this administration's fixation on trade deficits as somehow a barometer on whether a trade agreement is good or bad. I don't accept that. I don't think you can say a free trade agreement is bad for the U.S. because we're running a deficit, but that's a separate conversation. The notion of reducing a trade deficit is also a little bit misleading. You know, China could agree to buy $25 billion of liquefied natural gas and have a huge immediate reduction. That is a good thing, I guess, if you're selling LNG to China. But in terms of the overall competitive posture of the United States, it doesn't make much of a difference. So I think if there's an agreement on reducing a deficit, that's possible. And I think China may be interested in doing that. I'm not sure that's really a good thing to pursue. I think what you need to look at is the structural relationship between the U.S. and China.
Also, we know that ZTE came up in these talks, and that's important because, just to give people at home a bit of information, ZTE, of course, admitted selling information and technology to Iran and the DPRK. They got hit with a big fine, $1.1 billion perhaps, had to fire 4 people, and were supposed to punish 35 others, but they did not. In retaliation, the United States said you can't buy U.S. components for your phones for the next 7 years. Considering U.S. components make up 30% of the phones, that's a big hit. It really plays into President Xi's hand when he says we need to ramp up, not made in China, but created in China. Now the U.S. is trying to tell China, don't invest in technology. That seems like a non-starter.
Well, I think there's a lot of problems with going after one specific company. When you go after ZTE, you create a lot of problems for a lot of U.S. suppliers. All of those U.S. suppliers who are making money by selling to ZTE are just as negatively impacted as ZTE. So I would not focus too much on an individual case. Again, I would like to see this administration take a broader strategic view about what it is we're trying to do with China in terms of trade. And you can't focus immediately on numbers and result, because that ought to flow from a more long-term approach on structural issues with China. And that's where I think, going back to WTO commitments, we ought to be beginning the negotiations.